Okay, we're now
I've got to
recording,
be
Harry.
quiet
We're now
because I'm
recording,
not
Harry.
just in hospital for an appointment. This is an operation I'm having.
Yeah,
That's
having
the
an
thing.
Got to
Good
go
luck with
into it.
it.
Good luck, Henry, with
Okay,
that.
cheers.
Right, I'd
So
admit
I'm
all.
going to.
Yep, go on mute, Henry. Thanks for joining. Morning, John. Morning, Thomas. Morning, Richard. Morning, Shay. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining. Hi, John. Thanks for joining. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that would be great. Thank you very much. And that gives Harry the chance to speak. So let's mute a few people there. Thanks, Henry, for muting. Thanks, Harry. Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Before we start, I just wanted to say a couple of things. Number one, thanks for joining everybody. This week's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. Delighted to have Harry Scoffin on, and Harry's going to do his thing in a minute. A bit of housekeeping. Number one, our illustrious chairman Henry Tapper is going into hospital in the next half an hour for a big operation. So I want to, number one, wish him very, very well with his operation, and I hope it goes successfully. So we're all thinking of you, Henry, and be strong, and I'm sure it will be a success. So lots of wishes to you. Number two, strangely enough, we are going to be speaking at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month. So Harry and I will have a little alarm and have a little pause at 11 o'clock, just for a minute's silence for remembrance purposes. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of you will want to do that. I do, and presumably a lot of you will as well. So we'll pause at 11, just very quickly for a minute's silence, if that's all right. The other thing is we are recording. So John, Shay, Richard, thumbs up. We're okay to be recorded. So that's great. Thanks very much. We are recording. So I will now pass you on to Harry, and Harry's got a script presentation. Whatever you want to say, Harry. This is your show, so I'll pass over to you, and we'll come back in about 25 minutes with the minute silence. But over to you, Harry. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me, and all the best, Henry, with the operation you've got as well. Because the thing is, very quickly, I'm just a full-time campaigner to try and get rid of the residential leasehold tenure, and it's a very lonely fight because all the money is on the other side. And actually, it's quite rare to have people like Henry who have got that incredible background, in the economy, and actually know about things and have got authority, and actually to put their head above the parapet and actually say this is wrong, and actually give some clout to the movement that needs it. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for Henry and for having me on a second time. I didn't think I'd be coming back after the first one. But so very quickly, I just want to open up with three quotes because I think it just gives the context. This is one from the Competition and Markets Authority in 2019. It is a real concern that homeowners who have entered into a lease are captive consumers with very little influence over the costs incurred by landlords or their managing agents that will in due course be passed on to them. Then another one from the Law Commission a year later. The interests of leaseholders and landlords are diametrically opposed, and consensus will be impossible to achieve. Then we go back much further to 1909, down the road from me in Limehouse, with David Lloyd George, who said, look at all this leasehold system. This system, it is the system I'm attacking and not individuals. That's the same for me. It's not business, it's blackmail. So just yesterday, a member of my group, Free Leaseholders, was queuing for coffee on Canary Wharf, where she overheard a conversation between two young, obviously well-paid professional men. The one was telling the other about the two-bed new build flat he'd bought just 4 years ago and was now trying to sell so he could take on a new job. Great location, views, even a swimming pool and a gym. He'd happily paid £980,000 for it in 2021. Now local estate agents were telling him he'd be lucky to get 850,000. Too many flats on the market, they claimed. My Free Leaseholders colleague couldn't resist weighing in. Next time you buy, make sure it's not a leasehold. Oh, I know, the young man chirped in. I love flat living, but I would never do it again in this country. I'm moving to Chicago. At the other end of the spectrum, we spoke to a young couple who want to get married, buy a house and start a family. Their flat is unsellable at any price because the ground rent is more than 0.1% of the property value. So banks won't lend on it. They paid a surveyor, the to value the lease extension. He said £7,500. Their freeholder refused to extend for anything less than £70,000. Who's got that sort of money? Taking the case to court has cost them their savings and wrecked their mental health. They've lost the dream home they wanted to buy. 4 years later, they're still trapped. And a third example, if you'll indulge me, is even closer to home. My own mother's flat is in a mixed-use building, hotel on the lower floors, apartments above. Built by Manhattan Loft, it was sold at the time as a peak of luxury, offering the lifestyle of a hotel guest. Order room service, get your laundry done, live like the star you are. The reality has been very, very different. Service charges have skyrocketed. Ground rent doubles every 25 years. My mum is on £900 already. And meanwhile, maintenance has been non-existent. Lifts fail, pipes burst, windows whistle in the wind. For people in this building, it's not a case of lowering the price. These flats won't sell. Some local agents won't even list them anymore. We're locked into an extractive offshore billionaire landlord who, in one high-profile example reported by the Financial Times, used a related company at our sister development to gross up buildings insurance with a secret commission of £1.6 million over 10 years, completely unbeknownst to the leaseholders, until they mounted and won a grueling 5-year legal battle at tribunal against his army of lawyers in a KC. That landlord is currently being sued by the government over £20.5 million for the remediation of dangerous cladding. Now, you might say all of this is anecdotal. We do stats and systems. The worst of it is confined to London and the South East for now, but it translates into a real decline in the value of and demand for that vital first step on the home ownership ladder, flats. And beyond that, logic says the collapse in demand for flats must have a knock-on to the whole housing market. There seems to be no data kept on how many home purchases depend on the sale of a flat somewhere along the chain of buying and selling, but it must surely be considerable. And this too can only get worse now that the Renters' Rights Act is passed. People who would once happily have become accidental landlords for a time to tide them over a gap between selling a flat and buying a house are now too afraid to rent their properties. And of course, fewer small investors entering the private rental market at all is further depressing flat prices. All of this may well be entering a kind of doom loop. If flat prices continue to fall and both ground rents and service charges continue to escalate, more and more flats will become unmortgageable and therefore practically unsellable. And if flats won't sell, no amount of supply side measures to help developers build those mythical 1.5 million new homes in half a decade will work. They are simply not going to break ground. Why would they risk their capital? You just look at the Telegraph on Friday. Only 19 new build leasehold flats were shifted by developers in May in London, the part of the country with the worst affordability of the housing crisis. The Labour government's answer to this is all on the supply side: lower affordable housing quotas, reduced dual aspect windows, and faster planning approvals. Meanwhile, the Tories only talk of ending stamp duty. None of this is going to work. Free leaseholders is sometimes accused of trashing the flats market to force the abolition of residential leasehold tenure. We don't need to trash anything because the truth is out there. The public aren't fools. They understand that while a rented flat is something you can give notice and walk away from, a leasehold flat is a potential debt trap with no end. You thought you bought, but you gain a landlord. That landlord has a whip hand over the single biggest purchase of your life. On new builds, service charges tend to escalate after the first few years. Developers originally lowball the service charge to ensnare you, but freeholder landlords have no motive to look for the cheapest or most appropriate deals because they're not picking up the tab. On the contrary, everything from insurance to energy prices, they look to what will make them the biggest margin. They neglect maintenance to profit from the more expensive major works that then become necessary. The consequences for the state of all this new housing stock are grim. Some of these buildings are starting to fall into disrepair. And of course, if you don't pay all these charges, since leasehold is only another kind of tenancy, your landlord can just rip up the lease and take your flat with no compensation. It's called forfeiture. Now, you might say that's relatively rare, only about 80 to 90 successful forfeiture cases a year, but it's the threat that hangs over leaseholders. It's that threat of losing your home and all the equity inside it that forces you to pay up these ransom demands from these freeloading freeholders. And unlike the short-term rental tenant, we can't just walk away from the contract. We have to find someone willing and ignorant enough to buy. And every one of us who gets stuck in one of these debt traps moans about their misfortune to friends and family, like the man in the coffee queue. Young people may long for homes of their own, but they're not going willingly to put their heads in the noose of a leasehold flat. Not my generation. We've woken up. No matter what inducements, abolition of stamp duty, a help to buy 2.0, which is actually help to sell, a government may introduce, there is only one way out. Buying a home must mean exactly that. Like it is in Scotland and the rest of the world, you own what you buy and you control, along with your neighbours. In every other country in the world, that is how flat living works. In Sweden, the residents in mixed-use buildings even own and rent out the commercial floor space, which helps subsidise their own costs. That's the model we should be aiming for in England and Wales, whether you call it common hold, strata, title or condominium. No more extractive third-party landlords. And that goes for new building housing estates, where developers use a gap in the law to hand the sites over to friendly managing agents to extract cash from captive freeholders in perpetuity. It's called leasehold. The house owners have no legal right or structure to rid themselves of these built-in parasites. And yet our current government seems curiously unwilling to push on with these changes, even though they were elected on a manifesto expressly to end leasehold and fleasehold for good. To this point, Labour have been able to hide behind, the last year and a half they've been in power, the threat of lawfare from the multi-billion freeholder lobby who tried to overturn key provisions of Michael or Lord Gove's Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024 that would have made buying out your freehold easier and cheaper and paved the way for leasehold abolition. But 2 weeks ago, the government at the High Court won the judicial review in a 167-page judgment that was utterly decisive and dismissed all of their bogus human rights claims. The government has no excuse not to crack on, yet despite the size of its majority, remember, the second biggest parliamentary majority in Labour's 125-year history, it is paralysed by a strange poverty of ambition. All the housing minister Matthew Pennycook now talks about is regulating managing agents, when he knows perfectly well managing agents may be the interface between landlord and leaseholder, but they are not the problem. They are able to profiteer and loot because the law enables and even encourages them to do so. Leasehold makes your home into a profit centre for often offshore third parties, and that is what must end. We suspect the government fears that if they cap ground rents, abolish marriage value and do the rest, the money paid to freeholders when a lease is extended, the values of residential property investments will collapse, since freeholders will somehow leave the market en masse. This is ridiculous, of course. The Treasury, according to a recent Financial Times report, fears that this will trigger a wider systemic shock. Also, that it will somehow advertise to the world that contracts in the UK can be ripped up at will, deterring foreign investment. Freeholder claims that leasehold abolition is some kind of socialist attack on capitalism itself. It is not. Capitalism depends, for its success, on the freedom of markets and consumer choice. In leasehold, there is no free market. Consumers are captive. Each building or estate is a monopoly, where contract terms imposed by one very powerful party on a very weak one enable one side financially to exploit the other. The biggest investors in ground rents have already written down their investments. They told the High Court that. They know the end of this exploitative system must come, and soon. Leasehold is a form of parasitic rent seeking, nothing to do with capitalism. Harmful extractive behaviour that doesn't create value for the end user or consumer and does nothing to grow the economy. The economic damage of failing to abolish all leasehold is potentially far greater than the alternative that is currently paralysing Labour. They need to wake up before it is too late. And very quickly, because Henry did say I need to mention it for you, pensions and pensions adjacent audience, about Rothsay Life, M&G and some other players in this sector. Briefly on that, we know through public government transparency disclosures, they mounted a ferocious lobbying attempt. And I'm doing this all for free, voluntary. We've got other voluntary campaigners involved. And this is what we're up against, because we can't get into these meetings with ministers. We can't get into meetings with special advisors. But people like Rothsay and M&G, when you look at the disclosures, they get one-to-one meetings with the then Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. And unfortunately, Michael Gove, the then Secretary of State, wanted to cap all residential ground rents at a peppercorn or zero financial value. Now, what he didn't say was the logic behind that was basically by capping them at zero, you drain the value from the freeholds. Now, the freeholders still own the freeholds, but they will be less, they'll be worth less than what they were yesterday. But you could argue the same about capital controls, price controls, taxation. Investment is a risk. These guys didn't price political risk correctly. We shouldn't be getting at, let's get out tiny violins. These guys are very, very powerful, highly educated, big fund managers. I'm sorry, they shouldn't have basically hitched a ride on people's homes. It's deeply immoral, unethical, and it doesn't provide any value. And the fact is that even the Competition and Markets Authority at the time, unusually for a sort of government quango, came out and they basically published their response to the government consultation, and they said that monetary ground rent is quote neither legally necessary, nor did we see any persuasive evidence that it was commercially necessary. We heard no convincing justification for the payment of any ground rent in modern leaseholds. And then obviously we were up against a huge onslaught about pension funds, and we worked with Norma Cohen, the former FT pensions and property correspondent, and also a top UK actuary that many of you may have come across, called Peter Tompkins, to expose this bogus lobby line. And actually we found through our research that UK pension holdings are just about 4% in property. Now, mainly that will be commercial, that will be shopping centres, that will be industrial, land, and then some of it's residential. But the government actually went further. They found that actually less than 1% of UK pension holdings was in residential property. And remember, residential property doesn't just include leasehold. That'll be social housing, it'll be build to rent, which is booming right now. It won't be residential ground rents. And that's what Peter Tompkins told us. That actually, for pension funds, it's a really odd asset class for them to get involved in. And he was very dubious that they got involved in it in any way. And actually, very funnily, this Labour government are sitting on the results of that consultation done by the last government. Fortunately, we never got those reforms because of the lobbying, but also Sunak calling that early election. But the then Housing Minister, Lee Rowley, who's now in the private sector, but he did publish a taster of that consultation result. And he found, and it's in Hansard, so no one can say that I'm manipulating stuff. He said, whilst we will publish a full response shortly, we can confirm that the general response to the consultation has confirmed that ground rents represent at most a small percentage of total UK pension assets. In addition, no substantive evidence has been provided within the consultation that suggests, and I bold this, that there is a systemic risk to the operation of pension funds or the financial markets. Even the sector itself, in its so-called Option 6 alternative, has recognised the necessity of reform in this policy area. And last point, because many of you will know this because it's your trade body, Pensions UK. They used to be called the PLSA. And unfortunately, we got into a really nasty brawl with them because originally they gave us a statement where they blew this whole thing up. And they basically we got speaking to their head media person who said they wouldn't normally get involved in side debates that have nothing to do with their members. But on this occasion, the higher ups was so incensed that a wholly separate industry was invoking pension funds and that industry to protect their own kind of dodgy business model, that they unusually would put out a statement. And I will read this statement because they pretend that they never gave it, but they did. And this statement is this: pension funds aggregate allocation to all types of property, including commercial as well as residential, accounts for 4% of all pension holdings. You can hear the contempt dripping there. None of our members have expressed any concerns of us about proposed changes to rules affecting leasehold and ground rents. Now, that was the PLSA spokesperson that gave it in September 2023. Then the government under Michael Gove published a consultation literally weeks later in October. And they then somehow did a screeching U-turn without actually admitting to this statement, and then saying that pension funds will collapse, locusts, will descend. Basically, pensioners will go into penury, will be out on the streets, all very suspicious. And when you look at what they submitted to the government consultation, as Norma Cohen said, empty phrasing, no data provided to back up their claims. It was all very odd. And unfortunately, that was the situation. But one trade body that didn't let leaseholders down at the last minute was one, I think a newer one, smaller, is called the Society of Pensions Professionals. And they weighed in, and they didn't, sort of go quiet, or they didn't retract their previous statement. And they said the scale relative to total assets is probably not that significant for most in the long run. And last but not least, and I gave it to Henry, so it's not an exclusive for you, but we did a freedom of information request against the pensions regulator, and they came back. We never published it in the end because of the general election sort of killing this debate. But in their response to the FOI, they said, quote, any exposure that may be affected by the relevant reforms are likely to be limited. So all I say is thank you very much for having me on, and don't let your industry, noble industry, be used in this way to basically prop up something which is causing huge mental health issues and actually killing a core part of the property market. And as you know, the property market is entwined with our economy. So, if the government doesn't crack on, it will start hitting those of you in houses. Thank you.
Harry, thank you so much. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Henry here. I've got 3 letters to give you. ESG. Environmental, that's not this. Social, that is this. And G, governance, that is this. And if we have questions, and I have to go, unfortunately, because I can't stay through it, please can they centre around social and governance considerations for pensions, because we just can't behave like this. Thanks ever so much, mate.
And good luck with your operation, Henry. We wish you well. So Harry, I mean, obviously there's a lot more to be said, I think. I've got lots of questions myself, but obviously we'll open the floor up for some questions. We've got Tom McPhail on. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining at this session. Tom is a well-connected person, especially at the government level. Have you come across any of this campaign, Tom, or is this so small that you think a lot of ministers have ignored it, or do you think it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue? I mean, Harry's very passionate, and I love his passion. But what do you think?
Is he?
I don't know. He's on the fence. He hasn't really said much about it, But
Yeah, no, that was really good. So a couple of thoughts, and it's not something I've come across a lot, right? I was really interested in Harry's comments about Michael Gove and what he tried to do. I mean, I have been thinking a lot about the housing market recently, and I thought the Conservatives' announcement about scrapping stamp duty was an interesting one, because it appears that there isn't an economist in the land that disagrees with the proposal. Everybody thinks it'd be a good idea to get rid of stamp duty, and it would just free up the system. But that's not enough on its own. The planning regulations are not enough on their own. So it's really interesting to listen to Harry talk about how the freehold bind that has got flat owners trapped in their properties is not something I was really significantly aware of. I mean, I knew it existed, but I didn't really appreciate the scale of the problem. So I think it's kind of interesting that, it's not something I'd come across a lot. It's not something I've heard talked about. So I think it's really good that we've got sessions like this and people like Harry to raise the salience of it, because whilst clearly there is some action going on it. I mean, I guess my question to Harry, and I appreciate others want to ask questions, is, what's the steelman argument against what you're proposing here? If you were on the other side of the argument, what's the case being made that just everything's fine, leave it as it is?
Yeah, that's
where
a good
does that
one.
come from?
So the thing is, very quickly, because I'm always conscious if I bombard people with stats, people, and probably maybe for your audience, you prefer stats and case studies and stories, but
they love stats.
Very quickly, because
actuaries.
Yeah, the fact is that Hampton's found recently that 400,000 fewer flat owners put their homes on the market last year for fear of crystallizing losses. So this is a market failure. because the government are not getting rid of an extractive legal regime governing flats. And another thing is Zoopla came out a few months ago that we've now got the biggest gap in house and flat prices for 30 years. So actually, houses are surviving the economic headwinds, flats are not. And that is a huge issue. And John Byrne Murdoch at the Financial Times did a good article that we briefed him on a few years back, where he showed that actually, unusually for a property market, England, Wales, he compared against, I think it was America, Ireland, Scotland, and I think Northern Ireland. They all have forms of common hold, and actually the price differential between houses and flats rather was actually rather minimal. And actually, it was only England, Wales where you've got this yawning gap. But the steelman argument for the other side is that we don't live in Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. We can't just steal land from people. But this is where you need to turn it on its head. Their own lobby group, the Residential Freehold Association, and it's been on their website. They took it down, and then obviously they got advised by, I think, their lobbying company, Pagefield, to put it back because it looks shifty, taking it off. These freeholders only invest 2.5% capital value in a block of flats. We are not saying that the freehold should be taken away from them and given to the leaseholders for free. We want, something, if you've got to pay something, we don't want, something for nothing, but we're just saying buy out that 2.5%. And what's happened is that all the laws previously on leasehold has stuffed their mouths with gold with crazy formulas, a marriage value that shouldn't be there in the first place for leases under 80 years, and the fact is there hasn't been standardization. So it's a war between the landlord that wants to go super high and the leaseholder naturally who feels, why are they paying for their home a second time? And then it goes to tribunal, and the one with the best lawyers normally wins. And they have a formula that was done by, I think, Gerald Eve, that was paid for by the Duke of Westminster, that has obviously influenced case law. So what Gove was trying to do is have a standardized formula, which is called the deferment and capitalization rate. But the problem is that the freeholders sued this government and the last one to try and force them to fix the rates, fix the deferment rate lower than it is currently, which will actually make it more expensive for leaseholders to extend their lease or buy the freehold. But the thing is that it's very frustrating. People in the property sector, Hampton, Zoopla, they don't really want to talk about the leasehold issue because obviously that's not something their estate agents can fix, and they don't want to advertise this, debt trap scheme because obviously their members are reliant or their softwares are reliant on selling these things, and hats off to Rightmove and Zoopla. They finally introduced a toggle so you can toggle out leasehold now properties when you're looking at homes. But the thing is that what's interesting is that Labour talked a great game on this in opposition. They were attacking Gove, who ultimately didn't get his peppercorn dream, and now they're quiet. And that worries us because you've seen in the FT a few weeks ago, basically the freeholders, and I'm not to criticise the journalist, I get that the FT have to put a commercial spin on it, but they got about 80% of the article. They had the headline as well, UK landlords fear ground rent changes. That's like turkeys fearing Christmas. Naturally they will, and they're using this figure of 31 billion pounds, that 31 billion pounds will be destroyed and they need 31 billion pounds of compo, and they've reduced their number on the pension fund. Oh
Harry,
yeah, it's
we're going to have a
okay.
minute silence, please, and then we'll come back, and then we've got a question from JQ and John, but we'll do a minute silence now if that's all right. Okay, thanks for that, everyone. Really appreciate that. talking to Henry before the session today. His great grandfather was in the First World War, and my great grandfather was in the First World War. So it's good to remember the fallen. So yeah, really appreciate everybody's time. So that's great. So sorry, Harry, I interrupted you, and then we'll come to JQ. So yeah,
No
you
worries.
mentioned
And
about
so
this headline.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's the thing is that the FT, it was very framed towards the freeholders, and then they pushed this 31 billion pounds out. But the fact is, the pension funds argument isn't credible because we've blown it up now. But the only argument they've got now is that it will deter foreign investment, and it's against sanctity of contract. But the thing is, I really urge you to read the High Court decision, even just the last paragraph. But the court basically said that all these arguments that you as investors cannot suffer any loss is not correct in a democratic society. Parliament routinely interferes in contracts, and also they use the taxation analogy. Taxation can seriously impact the value of investments. Are you saying we don't have a taxation system? The fact is, Parliament can interfere with negative externalities. It can interfere in one-sided contracts for the public good. And that's what they said. Parliament has a wide margin of appreciation. And last time they did this sort of judicial review thing, it was the deceased Duke of Westminster, way before I was born in 1986. And it went all the way to the Strasbourg court, and they found the same thing. Basically, you can interfere in contracts to create fairness in markets. So the thing is that that's where we're at. But unfortunately, bizarrely, I think Labour are worried that this is going to come across as a Corbynista agenda, not realising that Adam Smith was violently against ground rents. Lots of pro-market, pro-capitalist people realise that leasehold has nothing to do with capitalism, and interfering in this area of the economy doesn't mean you're going to interfere in other parts. This is just clearly a wrong that's causing harm. So yeah, thank you very much for your question, Tom.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. JQ, you got your hand up. Let's start with you, and then we'll come to John Mather.
Morning, Harry. Very good, actually. I've got a couple of points, a couple of thoughts as well. Public law was an incredibly complex area, so taking on a government is a non-trivial thing. But fair play for you to sticking your head in that noose. My experience with the ESG piece has sadly been that the S and the G tag along on the E, so it tends to be, I've been told, it tends to be hijacked by social and governance related to environment, and therefore the S and the G on their own is a tough one. It's a tough one without it being something to do with carbon and oil and gas and so on. You're right about the some of the insurers. It looks to me as if they have increased some of their solvency capital reserves. I suspect there's a couple of one of them you mentioned that are expecting a write down in their ground rent assets. The question I have is where the competition authority, when you've got a lopsided market, it's no such thing as free markets. Unconstrained free markets are brutal. I mean, they cause so much damage, and free market economists always believe in that until it comes and hurts them, and then they have a different view. The competition authority, have any thoughts about engaging with them? Because it feels as if there's clearly a very, very, very biased market here.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can,
Yep,
yeah.
you're on
Oh,
mute,
thank
Harry.
you for that question. Yeah, so the thing is that the problem is it's a bit like engaging with the Law Commission because it comes under the government. If the government of the day doesn't want to move on this and they've made an editorial decision on policy not to do it, the fact is that they're just basically part of that. And I saw the other few months back that they've ousted the chair, haven't they? Or they put in some sort of guy that's going to prop up the sort of pro-growth messaging. And it's such a shame because this is a pro-growth policy agenda, not necessarily about saving people a few £100s a year, although that will be helpful. It's actually getting the flats market moving. So the thing is that they were very emboldened by the last government, and now it's gone all quiet with them. And they've even said publicly that they're not doing anything more on leasehold. They've done their bit, and to be fair to them, at one point, I think they managed to get undertakings from various freeholders, not just developers, and they amended about 20,000 leases where you had some of the really extreme, I think it was the doubling every 5 or 10 years where it was just obscene to begin with. But again, that's not really fixed the issue because all it did was move them to RPI. And I think there were RPI escalator clauses that lenders don't want anyway. So the thing is that we're at a sort of dead end, sadly, with this government, and all we're trying to do now is basically raise the salience, be everywhere. So I was on
Okay.
Matthew Wright with LBC the other day, hijacking a general property story to bring it back to leasehold. That's, Vanessa Feltz a few weeks before, even the FT managing to crowbar in a quote from us at the end, basically shaming Labour and saying, they're sucking up to rent seekers and they've got the second biggest majority in their 125-year history. But it's really truly tricky, and Michael Gove has weighed in occasionally because we tried. I think you may have been referring to it at the beginning. I wasn't sure, but we tried to weigh in on the judicial review, and we got a bunch of organisations together that have been, some of them fighting for leaseholder rights since the 1970s, and we tried to be an intervener because what we're worried about is you had the 7 freeholders, some of whom have even hired the Prime Minister's best friends, Edward Fitzgerald KC, his former boss at Doughty Street Chambers, and then also Mark Stevens, the media lawyer who famously worked with Keir on the McLibel case, which also went all the way to Strasbourg. We tried to be an intervener to get leaseholders' voice heard, and the court turned around and said, we managed to get, actually bizarrely, Michael Gove at the last minute said, I could be your witness if you want it. So we brought him in, and even then, but at least, even though we were rejected, I think it weighed on the High Court that they realised that actually, if they were going against the will of Parliament, the will of the people, they were going to get into deep trouble politically if they did that. Because an act of Parliament, you can't actually blow it up. Secondary regulation, you can. But they could have said a declaration of incompatibility, that it was incompatible with Article 1, Protocol 1 of the ECHR. So it's interesting and it's funny. All these people that foam at the mouth about Human Rights Acts and judicial review on the right of British politics, they've been absolutely silent on this, which is strange. GB News want to try and get them excited. Daily Mail, to be fair, did a piece on it a few days ago. And it's odd. The government spent a lot of money defending the case. The freeholders spent £5 million doing it. And yet there's not been a government press release. The ministers haven't been on the airwaves. All there was 3 measly tweets from the housing minister. Blink and you'll miss it. We were the only people that were promoting the government's win. So for me, that feels very wrong. It feels like the plan all along was to lose the tournament. They won this game. That's what we're worried about. And if you've got anyone, even if they're in your industry where the daughter's trapped or they're a leaseholder or they've got friends that even want to give us even a few minutes of their time or, open up doors for us, we would be so grateful. Obviously, we've not got any money to sort of pay, these people, but we'll have a coffee with them or thank them because it's so desperate. And all of the lobbying, even M&G, if you look at their accounts recently, they've noted that they're concerned about Labour's promised leasehold and commonhold reform bill. And then you look at the there's an online register of lobbying. I've forgotten what it's Orcal, I think it's called. And in there, from I think the first few months of the Labour government, so around the time that the King's speech was happening, they hired Peter Mandelson's Global Council lobbying firm. Now, we were never able to confirm whether it was on ground rents lobbying, but it's odd that Matthew Pennycook in opposition said he supported peppercorn. Now he's a minister, we hear nothing. And we did an FOI, or someone did an FOI, not us. And the government have refused to publish the results of that consultation that we all worked so hard in responding. So many people did, so many stakeholders, even from your industry, and yet the government are not publishing it.
Interesting. Well, one thought that jumped out again as you were speaking was that clearly the Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, the Treasury are interested in productive capital. It would be a fascinating thing. I've not thought about it before until you started speaking to establish who are the ultimate owners of the ground rent contracts, because one of the insurers you mentioned there certainly has got Singaporean, Swiss, and I think PE American, whereas productive capital, putting money back into or not taking money off people who are UK taxpayers, is clearly a direct productive capital boost. And I don't know whether you've looked. I've not thought about that before, but as you spoke, it made me think about. It's not about flag wave. Not flag wave for Little England, do. It's just about keeping money in the UK.
We have peer surveil, and the thing is, you're right. Like even people like Rothsay, they don't actually own the freeholds. They've just lent money to freeholders, and sometimes they're using is it debenture structure so that the ground rent they'll get if they default on the loans. And you look at who they've lent to, at least on the public records. One company is called E&J, run by a sort of Hampshire-based former Tory donor called James Tuttiett, who at one point owned 44,000, freeholds to leasehold properties. and then another guy or another company called um, Consensus Business Group, I believe, which is Vincent Schengitz, I think, and Robbie Schengitz. So that, you know, the
Nice.
fact is that the problem is if they tried to intervene to protect the wrongdoers in the car finance scandal, that's the Treasury's house view on anything really. They're going to protect the wrongdoers over the wrong consumers. So
They're
the
probably
problem is
scared.
that's what we're worried
They're probably
about.
scared.
They're scared, and they're scared about conversation, even though they've just had this incredible win in the High Court that should stiffen their spine to go faster and further. So it doesn't feel right.
Thank you.
Cheers,
John
Harry.
or
John,
anyone else?
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. What do you want to say, John? Do you want to unmute, John?
It seems to me you had a contract to buy a property, and what you're complaining about is that there wasn't sufficient discount given for the value that you're not receiving and owning. If there's a loss there at that point, who gave you the advice? Question mark. Who is responsible for the negligence of giving you that advice? And is there a case for a class action against the lawyers who actually were advising at the point of purchase? See, my concern is you've got all this energy and obviously sincerely felt, but the danger is you're going to finish up like a lot of other people with good cases, kick down the road. There's a nautical term called pissing into the wind, which is essentially relief at the time, but a mess when you look what you did. And your energy, I think, should be directed at going after compensation for the point of sale, because that's clearly the lawyer's box. I doubt whether they've got any disclaimers on advice, but they certainly advised on the contract, and it was wrongly priced. So that's the weak point, surely.
The thing is, for me, I find, you know, with respect, I find this a Jeremy Kyle question when he lobbed it to my mum a few years ago. The fact is, it's all downstream from the fact that Parliament is refusing to get rid of an inherently exploitative legal structure. And the fact is, even lenders lent against this stuff, they were asleep at the wheel, but it doesn't change. Even if these guys were not willing to lend on these properties, or, you know, conveyancers were like, oh, don't buy them. The fact that developers are still creating this harmful structure because Parliament allows them to do is wrong. And that's what the rest of the world.
I promise you, if developers weren't selling properties, or they didn't get the price that actually they're getting, either getting full market value for delivering 80% of the value. So they would certainly, if they stopped selling.
That assumes that basically everyone's a rational actor. And the fact is, housing is a prime social need, and they're actually abusing the fact that people are desperate for a roof over their head. And basically,
you can't add to you can't add to the people who are being irrational. You've got a contract. It happened in the past when the law was what it is, and that's the point at which there's no argument. The thing was sold at too high a price and not sufficient.
What do you say
given.
about the fact that residential leasehold contracts are exempt from unfair contracts legislation and consumer rights? That was done deliberately to ensnare buyers. The fact is that if we, and there are class actions, there's one at the moment going on about buildings insurance commissions. That doesn't get the law changed. What will is that consumer behaviour is changing now. 19 new builds in London, flats, were shifted. The fact is that if the government, where I agree with you is markets are powerful. And actually, we're now wielding the full force of the markets. We're not wasting time on lawyers and class actions that may never materialise, because you've got to get in big backers. You know, it's a huge thing. There's this one on insurance commissions.
You've got enough disappointed people to crowdfund that action.
But the thing is, I get what you're saying. If people price the leasehold contracts correctly, then it would have taken into account all of the commissions, all of the kickbacks, all of the grossing up of service charges. I don't think that's the case. What's happened is that a structure that may have worked, because you speak to people where it was actually okay in the 60s and 70s, then what's happened is that the nature of the people that came in and owned the freeholds changed. And that was in the late 90s, early 2000s, like the Vincent Schengitz, like my freeholder, John Christodoulou, who's a billionaire in Monaco. The fact is that the model changed. One point, it was burdens and benefits. The landlord would take the burdens for providing some benefits, and it might have been the guy down the street, a bit like a buy-to-let landlord. He would have actually cared about good procurement of the roof works. But now it's these sort of rentier, offshore, extractive companies that don't give a toss about the occupiers. So for me, I get you're saying that, you know, I'm going to get burnt out and all the rest of it. There are other groups out there that claim the salvation is endless class actions and doing that. For us, it's about, and it's sad, we get emails where people are so desperate and they say you're damaging our flat prices. And what I say to them is we're not. It's the greed of the freeholders and the managing agents, and it's people now
But,
working it out. And I think
but
the thing is,
you see that they're all not evil. They're the evil misusers as you've described, but they're not all the same. I
but
mean,
the
if you
thing is,
take,
it's
for
a bit
instance, where
like
I used to live in,
slavery.
if you
No,
take
it's a bit
the
like
case of the estate in Marylebone that's kept Marylebone like a village and a pleasant place to live, because they took a 200-year view of the way in which they were managing their properties. I mean, surely you're not going to destroy those as well in the action.
But these are outlier cases, and it's a bit like slavery, saying there are some good slave owners, they looked after the slaves. Actually, no, it's the system that's wrong. And for us, it's a systems thing. You've got to get rid of the system. We've got the second lowest proportion of flats of any country in Europe after Ireland, which also inherited leasehold. And culturally, they resisted being tenants under freeholders. So the fact is, if we want to grow our economy, we've got to live much closer to work. We've got to avoid these long, expensive, sapping commutes. We've got to join Europe and the rest of the world. That means creating a model that people want to buy into, that they can own and trust and love. And I get your point, and it's of that older generation where they say you didn't have to sign the contract, you know, you take it out on the conveyancer. No, because that perpetuates the inequality. That perpetuates the exploitative system that has got my mum in a noose, that's ruined her life, that's ruined my life, and many, many others. And I think that's the thing. I get your point about the Duke of Westminster, you know, Cadogan Estate, beautiful places, sure, but they can care about their buildings as a rental landlords or commercial landlords. They don't need to be in leasehold, you know, and they've had good innings. They've had decades, generations of this system. They've been on warnings for years. Even Maggie, you know, maybe you're a fan of Margaret Thatcher. She hated leasehold. She saw it as an absolute stain on society and was stopping her people from being masters of their own destiny. And it was going to be a right to buy 2.0, letting the little people become freeholders and fully paid up members of the property owning democracy. Because feudalism is antithetical to capitalism. Capitalism is choice and consumer control. Feudalism is coercion and exploitation and a huge power imbalance. Even if there's a good, you know, landlord, the one that's bad is going to abuse that system, and that's what we're seeing. And I think that's the thing. Maybe there was something where maybe you bought a first-time buyer and you bought a flat and you traded up to a house that was in the 80s and 90s. It's just got out of control. And I think that's what's happening. It's market failure. It's not about contracts. And also, developers would use their power to insist to buyers. This is also on the Help to Buy scheme, by the way, government backed, that they would only sell the property if you used their own solicitor, because they had panels. And solicitors, SRA said it's absolutely fine. That's the problem with these trade bodies.
I set your mind at rest. I was not a Thatcher fan, and having done 700 property transactions in my career, I know a little bit about freeholds and leaseholds.
But all I'm saying is
think,
why do we have to be an outlier in the world? The fact is, this is a progressive, pro-growth thing, and I get your point about
why do you have to be a lemming and go over the cliff with the rest of them then? I mean, that's an irrational argument. I'd rather you stick to the rational stuff. Well,
the rational argument is that the leaseholders have paid a premium for their property. They didn't get something for free, and all we're saying is change the laws to make it easier for us to buy out the minority shareholder. That's in company law. Why can't we have that for our homes? That's all we're saying. Buy out the 2.5%. We will have to pay them. We will have to compensate them. No one's saying Mugabe. But if you just go after at that level of the conveyancer, it keeps the system going, and it keeps that going, and that's wrong. My generation, we want to own our own homes. We don't want to be glorified rental tenants with mortgages, service charges we can't control.
If you're going to win a war, you pick a battle that you know you're going to win to start off with. You don't try and throw your troops at the whole battlefront all at once.
No, right? What we're doing is carpet bombing. We're carpet bombing. We are basically showing the world what's going on in this country, and we're showing buyers do not buy leasehold flats.
Sadly, the world doesn't
hang on,
care.
John. If you, Harry,
the world does care. The world does care. I can send you reams of material in the media. We've been everywhere. You've just not been paying attention.
So, John, if you were Harry, what would your strategy be?
I'd pick a battle that I could win and start there, and then build on that.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a fair comment.
Okay. Battles we've won. 2022 Act. We've got ground rents banned on new leases. 2024 Act. When Sunak called the election, Gove's legislation hung in the balance. We had 48 hours. We did a huge whipping campaign, and we got it into the wash up with a prime minister that didn't want the legislation. We've already won 2 battles that we set our sights on, meaning
Well
that
done,
now
Harry.
Labour have got a structure that they're being forced to deliver. You know, and they also in March, this is important because I don't say it often. I went onto the Lewis Goodall show on LBC. I slammed government foot dragging on leasehold. That very same week, the housing minister appeared on the same show and announced, after a year in power, basically, Labour was switching on a key provision of Michael Gove's Act called Right to Manage, which now is helping millions of leaseholders get management control. That was me. That was our campaign.
Well done,
So the
Harry.
fact
That's
is,
really
we are
good.
choosing small battles, but what we're also doing is a big thing of carpet bombing. We're carpet bombing the sector so that the government is forced to change because markets are more powerful than governments. And that's the
Okay.
only thing that's going to do this because all the money is on the other side. So we're using the market against that.
Okay, Harry. We've got Shay McCarthy's put a comment in the chat. Shay, do you want to just unmute and just give us your opinion? I think you're. Let me say you're of the younger generation, Shay. Are you affected by this, or have you got friends who are affected by this? And if so,
Uh,
what is the answer? And is Harry doing the right thing?
so I have 2 points on this. So, Harry, well done for your efforts in getting this out there, because actually on the pensions side, which is defined benefits, I've been doing research on for some time, and I'm working on something called the dual state, and I've tracked the dual state from back in the day all the way to today. And to answer Steve's question, yes, I do know a lot of people who are affected by this. And coming back to the contract point, they aren't always advised, they don't read the contract, they don't understand the implications of this, and management fees do go up. In fact, I was born in South Africa, and it's a real problem in South Africa. So you buy a flat, and it won't even be, we don't have freehold leasehold here, but the management fees will just keep on going up and up until you want to sell the flat, but you can't actually find a buyer because it's not doable to actually buy a flat like this. On the dual state, I have one thought which you might find interesting. So if you take the application of the rule of law as it was back in the day when we had the feudal system, etc., etc., and you really look at the systemic events which shocked the system and by which the peasants, as they were called, started to assert their rights, you'll find that every time there was a shock to the system, the peasants developed a legitimate expectation and the dual state started to break down. But if you take the application of the rule of law to a dual state, obviously it only yields outcomes in favor of the upper classes, as you said, the people who can afford the richest lawyers, who have friends, etc., etc. And from my perspective, in looking at DB pensions very, very closely, in order to break down the system, you really need to hammer the dual state and you need to hammer the rule of law and you need to break down the system. And as you said, it needs to be a systems change. So you need to find a way of changing the system. It's all very well to say that there's a contract and you sign the contract, but that's not pursuant to social justice, because you can't expect everybody in the UK to be a lawyer and to really understand how these things work and the implications. Not everybody's an economist, not everybody's gone to Oxford, not everybody had those opportunities. So in my perspective, yes, there are a lot of people impacted by this. A lot of people can't afford to be impacted by this, and you don't have access to the rule of law in order to fight this. So I think it's a really important cause, and I agree completely that you need to change the system. Thank you, Steve.
Harry, some kind words there, I think, from Shay.
Thank
Lots
you
of
so
compliments.
much. That's a bit of a boost, but I agree with you absolutely that we're interested in systems change and let other groups go and do the class actions that could go on for years and not actually yield any results. And I absolutely agree with you that the fact is that we've got to basically mobilize public opinion on our side, which it is. I think there was a poll done by YouGov a few years ago. 67% of voters support getting rid of leasehold. So, but all we need to do now is actually get the market changing, and that's happening. 19 new build flats, leasehold sold by developers. But what we're worried about is that the developers are going to push for everything that doesn't solve the problem, but actually suckers new people in, like Help to Buy 2, like a stamp duty cut, and all of these sort of demand side stuff, and not actually not getting rid of the system. So absolutely, it's interesting about South Africa because I've got friends over there, and they said, it's not the best, but they do have it. I think it's called sectional title, so it's a little bit similar to commonhold. But it's interesting to hear that they obviously they have issues with ramping up service charges, but at least you've got some form of alignment of interest, which we don't have in England and Wales, because at least you appoint the managing agent. My understanding of the system, and if you're not happy with the managing agent, you can, call an AGM or whatever, or the directors go and the resident directors sack that company. But we just don't have that in England and Wales right now. And I think that's the issue. So for people that say leasehold, it can work. I guess it can work where the residents own the freehold or they have something called right to manage. But that is few and far between, sadly. So I just really want to thank you for your really helpful clarifying comments.
Yeah, that's really good. We're nearly out of time, Harry, but thinking sort of at the sort of global well, I say global, the big numbers, do we know how many people are affected by this? Number one. And number two, if the government had the odd few billion lying around, could the government get rid of the problem and just buy out all of the freeholders and go, well, get rid of those ground rents, you're going to get, I don't know, XP in the pound,
Yeah.
problem solved. Is that actually a reality that could
Yeah,
happen?
so there's 5.3 million leasehold households in England and Wales. It's about 20% of the English housing stock. And a few years ago, leaseholders in flats were paying £7.6 billion in service charges. You're right. The UK government or parliament could basically wave a legislative wand and say we're doing mandatory conversion of leasehold to common holds, and that there is basically the state will compensate. But I think that's probably never going to happen. What we just need to do is make sure that the formula is as easy as possible, it's non-speculative, and that it is something as easy as other jurisdictions have done, 10 times your ground rent. And for those that don't have a ground rent because it's a peppercorn or it's £10, you maybe create another scheme, but it's got to be simple. And I think that's what the freeholder lobby are fighting against, but hopefully we'll get there.
But hang on, if you've got 5.3 million, is that 5.3 million properties?
5.3 million properties, so it could be in theory 10 million people if it's two
I was going
people
to say, if
to a
you've got an
property.
average of two, then that's a big chunk of the population, isn't it? That's affected.
And I think it's about mobilizing them in an election as well. And the thing is, some of these majorities of the government are very, very thin. And the fact is, all you need is one block of flats, and that can tip, a Labour candidate out of it for an opposition candidate. So you're right, but it's about mobilizing. It's very, very difficult. But yeah, I think you're right. And they did it something similar in Scotland where they did mandatory conversion, but they were in a much better starting position because they had far fewer. You see what I mean? They didn't have millions.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
thank you
talking
very much
about
for having me.
no, really good, really good to hear you from you, Harry, and we wish you success with that. Does anybody have any comments or any last minute questions? Tom, are you obviously it's new for you, Tom, but presumably it's an interesting subject, and I think even us in the pensions world need to start sort of listening and sitting up and hearing this stuff, because Henry says the S and the G is important to our world, isn't it? So.
Well, yeah, and just since you've called me back into the conversation, Harry, I'd like to connect separately. I've been writing columns for the Times fairly regularly,
Oh,
and I
wow.
see you've been quoted in the Times in the past earlier this year. But I think it'd be interesting just to get some briefing notes from you, talk to my editor, see if there's the scope to pick this up
Wow.
again, because I think it's a really interesting story.
And maybe
Yeah.
we grab a coffee as well. That would be lovely. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. And also, by the
Harry's
way,
famous.
it's not personal. I'm there to be provocative and to cause a debate because this is a serious issue. So it's not personal to anyone on this call, by the way.
I
So
appreciate
thank
that,
you.
Harry. Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much indeed for everybody's input. Thank you, Harry, for your passion and for your belief on that. We wish you success in whichever battle you choose to fight. And yeah, we'll no doubt get you back maybe next year. Shay's got virtual clapping, Larissa and Richard, I'm sure, and JQ as well. Thanks for all joining. Hope you enjoyed the session. The video will be up later on today. And Harry, we wish you success and thank you for your time and your input and your energy. Brilliant. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks a lot. Cheers, Tom.